The morning sun cast a golden glow over the small town of Rockford, where life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The town square, lined with old-fashioned brick buildings, bustled with early risers heading to work, chatting over coffee and running errands. Among them was James "Jim" Carter, a retired Marine veteran, walking down the street with a quiet dignity that only those who had seen the worst of the world carried. His worn-out boots scuffed against the pavement, his tattered jacket doing little to shield him from the cool autumn breeze. He wasn't homeless, but to the untrained eye, he might as well have been. He was just another forgotten hero, blending into the background of everyday life. Jim had seen war, fought battles, and sacrificed more than most could ever imagine, but none of that mattered now. Civilians rarely looked past the surface, and the only thanks he often received came from an occasional polite nod or an empty "thank you for your service." He had learned not to expect much. Today, he just wanted a warm meal. His stomach growled as he passed Thompson's Diner, a small yet well-known restaurant on the corner. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon drifted from inside, tempting him to step in. With a sigh, Jim adjusted the strap of his old canvas bag and pushed open the door. A small bell jingled overhead, but no one paid much attention to his entrance. The diner was busy, filled with the usual crowd, locals catching up on gossip, truckers refueling before a long drive, and a few young couples enjoying breakfast. Sarah Thompson, the young waitress moving swiftly between tables, briefly glanced up from pouring coffee. Her friendly smile faltered for just a second when she noticed Jim's worn appearance, but unlike others, she didn't turn away. Jim found an empty booth near the window and sat down, his joints aching from years of hard service. He exhaled, letting the warmth of the diner ease the stiffness in his bones. Moments later, Sarah approached with a notepad in hand, her bright blue eyes filled with kindness. "Good morning, sir," she greeted him with a genuine smile. "Can I get you some coffee to start?" Jim nodded, offering a faint smile in return. "That would be great, black, please." Sarah scribbled on her notepad and hesitated for a moment. She could tell Jim wasn't just another drifter. There was something in the way he carried himself, something honorable. But before she could say more, a sharp voice cut through the diner. "What's he doing here?" Jim didn't even have to look up to know the voice belonged to Tom Riley, the restaurant's owner. A stout man in his late 50s, Tom had a reputation for being particular about who he allowed to dine in his establishment. He was a man who valued appearances, and to him, Jim didn't fit the image of a paying customer. Sarah straightened, trying to maintain her composure. "He's just here for breakfast, Tom, like everyone else." Tom scoffed, walking over with an air of authority. He glanced at Jim, his lip curling slightly in disapproval. "We don't do charity here," he said loud enough for nearby customers to hear. A few heads turned, but no one intervened. It wasn't the first time Tom had turned someone away. Jim met Tom's gaze calmly, unshaken. He had faced far worse men in his lifetime. "I didn't ask for charity," he said, his voice steady. "Just a meal." Tom folded his arms. "You got money to pay for it." Jim reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. He placed them on the table, keeping his face unreadable. "Enough for a coffee and breakfast, I'd say." Tom glanced at the money but made no move to take it. Instead, he snorted and shook his head. "Not interested. We don't need your kind making my customers uncomfortable." Sarah stiffened. "Tom, that's not fair." But Tom cut her off with a glare. "Get back to work, Sarah." The tension in the diner was thick. A few customers lowered their heads, pretending not to hear, while others exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke up. No one challenged Tom. Jim sat still, absorbing the weight of the moment. He had been disrespected before, far worse than this, but it never stopped stinging. He slowly stood up, gathering his money and stuffing it back into his pocket. "Guess I'll take my business elsewhere," Jim muttered, turning toward the door. Sarah bit her lip, torn between her job and her conscience. She wanted to say something to stop him, but she knew Tom wouldn't hesitate to fire her. She could only watch as Jim walked toward the exit, his shoulders heavy, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. Just as he reached for the door, the unmistakable roar of motorcycle engines rumbled outside. The deep, thunderous growl of multiple bikes idling in front of the diner sent a ripple of unease through the restaurant. Every head turned toward the window as a group of leather-clad bikers dismounted their motorcycles and strode toward the entrance. Their jackets bore patches that sent a clear message. They were veterans. The door swung open. Mike Grizzly Logan, a towering man with a thick beard and piercing eyes, stepped inside. He scanned the room, his gaze landing immediately on Jim. A slow grin spread across his face. "Jim," Grizzly's deep voice boomed through the diner. "That you, brother?" The entire atmosphere in the diner shifted. Tom, suddenly less confident, paled slightly. Sarah's heart pounded in anticipation. Jim turned, surprise flickering across his face. He hadn't seen Grizzly in years. "It's me," Jim replied. Grizzly and his crew stepped forward, their boots thudding against the tiled floor. The customers watched in silence, sensing that something was about to change, something that would make them question everything they had just witnessed. And for the first time since Jim walked in, Tom Riley looked genuinely nervous. A heavy silence settled over the diner as the biker gang made their way inside, the sound of their boots echoing against the tiled floor. The scent of leather and motor oil clung to them, their presence commanding attention without a single word. Mike Grizzly Logan, the group's leader, was the first to approach Jim, his sharp eyes scanning his old friend with a mix of surprise and concern. "It's been a long time, brother," Grizzly said, his voice rough yet warm. Jim gave a small nod. "Too long." The two men clasped hands in a firm grip, a silent exchange of respect passing between them. The other bikers, Rick Viper Johnson, Tony Diesel Harris, Jake Ghost Ramirez, and Darryl Hawk Evans watched the interaction closely before stepping forward, each giving Jim a nod or a pat on the shoulder. They weren't just any bikers. They were former military men, bonded by a past most civilians could never understand. Across the diner, Tom Riley shifted uncomfortably behind the counter. His usual arrogance wavered as he realized these men weren't just random bikers. They were brothers-in-arms with the very man he had just humiliated. The other customers sensed the shift in power too, their once indifferent gazes now glued to the unfolding scene. Sarah, standing by the coffee machine, clenched her notepad tightly. She had never seen Tom look so uneasy. A part of her wanted to smile at the poetic justice of it all, but she also knew Tom well enough to expect him to dig his heels in. Trying to reclaim control of the situation, Tom cleared his throat and forced a smirk. "Didn't realize you knew this crowd, Carter." Grizzly turned his head, his sharp gaze locking onto Tom like a predator sizing up prey. "Oh, we go way back. Served together, fought together." He tilted his head. "And from the look on Jim's face when we walked in, I'm guessing you weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat." Tom stiffened, his smirk faltering. "Look, this isn't about disrespect. It's just we have standards here." Rick Viper let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Standards," he repeated. "You mean you don't serve veterans?" Tom raised his hands in mock innocence. "Now, I didn't say that, but I have a business to run, and people don't want to eat their meals sitting next to a guy who looks like he just crawled out of a ditch." A ripple of tension spread through the bikers. Jim remained silent, his expression unreadable, but the slight twitch in his jaw told them everything. He had taken the insult in stride before, but now, with his brothers beside him, the weight of the moment was different. Grizzly took a slow step forward, the air thick with unspoken warning. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This man right here," he gestured at Jim, "put his life on the line for this country, and you won't serve him because he doesn't fit your standards." Tom scoffed, but his confidence was faltering. "That's not." "That's exactly what you said. Tony Diesel cut in, folding his massive arms. And you know what? That's some real unpatriotic garbage right there. Tom's face reddened, but he was too proud to back down. Look, it's my restaurant. I decide who I serve. Viper took a step forward, his presence alone enough to make Tom take a slight step back. Funny thing about respect, he said. It's a two-way street, and right now you're driving the wrong way. Sarah watched the exchange with wide eyes, her heart pounding. She had never seen anyone stand up to Tom like this. The other customers were frozen in place, uncertain whether they should intervene or pretend not to be involved. Jim finally broke his silence, exhaling slowly before looking Tom in the eyes. I didn't come here looking for trouble, just wanted a meal. His voice was calm, but the hurt was there, buried beneath layers of quiet dignity. Tom let out an irritated sigh. Fine, you want a meal, whatever, just order quick and don't cause any trouble. The bikers exchanged glances, amused at Tom's sudden change in tune. But Grizzly wasn't done yet. He turned to Sarah. You're the waitress here, right? Sarah straightened. Yes, sir. He grinned. Good, then I'd like to place a pretty big order. He turned back to his crew. What do you guys want? The bikers smirked, catching on immediately. Ghost Ramirez leaned back and said, Oh, I'll take the biggest steak you got. Same, Hawk Evans chimed in. Throw in some bacon and eggs, Viper added. Sarah scribbled furiously, trying to keep up with their requests. Anything else? She asked. Grizzly's smile widened. Yeah, give Jim whatever he wants and put it all on one tab. Jim looked at his old friend, eyes narrowing slightly. Grizzly, I can pay for my own meal. I know, Grizzly said, clapping him on the shoulder. But today we got you. Jim exhaled, the weight in his chest easing just a little. He knew better than to argue when Grizzly had made up his mind. Tom gritted his teeth, clearly displeased but unable to argue. He snatched Sarah's notepad. Fine, but don't expect any special treatment. Oh, don't worry, Viper said, flashing a grin. We're expecting exactly what we deserve. As Tom stormed off to the kitchen, the atmosphere in the diner had completely shifted. The once quiet customers whispered among themselves, some realizing they had judged Jim too quickly. Sarah, finally feeling a sense of victory, poured Jim a fresh cup of coffee and gave him a small, reassuring smile. Jim wrapped his hands around the warm cup, a slow, grateful nod in her direction. He wasn't a man of many words, but in that moment, he didn't need to say anything. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. And as he sat there, surrounded by his brothers, he knew that no matter what happened next, he wasn't alone. The air inside the diner was thick with an unspoken challenge. Jim Carter sat at the center of it all, surrounded by his old military brothers, their presence an unshakable force of solidarity. Across the counter, Tom Riley, the diner owner, slammed plates onto the service window with unnecessary force, his jaw clenched tight as he barked orders at his short-order cook. Sarah, still shaken by the confrontation, moved swiftly between tables, refilling coffee cups with shaky hands. She stole glances at Jim and the bikers, her heart pounding with something between fear and admiration. No one had ever stood up to Tom like that before. Jim stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, still processing the weight of what had just happened. He wasn't one for conflict, but the way Grizzly, Viper, Diesel, Ghost, and Hawk had stepped in for him, it meant something. After all these years, after all the battles they had fought, they still had his back. But Tom wasn't done yet. From behind the counter, Tom shot Sarah a glare. Hurry it up, would ya? I don't have all night. Sarah flinched but kept her head down. She placed a plate of steaming food in front of Jim, a well-cooked steak, mashed potatoes, and green beans. It was a decent meal, but something about it felt off. Jim noticed immediately. He picked up his knife, only to find the blade dull and barely able to cut through the meat. He tested the fork. One of the prongs was bent. He exhaled slowly, his grip tightening just slightly around the utensils. Viper noticed first. Oh, hell no. He reached over and grabbed Jim's fork, inspecting it with a smirk. You trying to be funny, Tom? Tom crossed his arms, a smug grin creeping onto his face. Mistakes happen. If he's got a problem, he can leave. The table went silent. Jim set the knife and fork down carefully, his face unreadable, but his silence spoke louder than words. Grizzly leaned forward, resting his massive arms on the table. Let me ask you something, Tom. You ever serve a paying customer with busted silverware before? Tom shrugged. Like I said, mistakes happen. Jim nodded slowly, then pushed the plate away. I lost my appetite. Sarah, her face pale, stepped forward. I can get you a new set of silverware, she said quickly, glancing nervously between the men. Grizzly held up a hand. No, sweetheart, it's not your fault. His eyes, dark and unwavering, remained locked on Tom. Diesel cracked his knuckles. So, this is how you treat veterans, huh? The same kind of men who fought for your freedom, who risked everything so you could run this little greasy spoon. Tom's face twitched. Nobody asked them to. That did it. The entire diner fell deathly silent. Even the regulars, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, froze mid-bite. Jim felt something deep in his chest tighten. He had heard variations of that phrase before, dismissive, callous words from people who would never understand the sacrifices made by those who had served. But hearing it now from Tom Riley, a man who reaped the benefits of others, sacrifices without ever making his own, it hit different. Viper leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. You know, I've met some real pieces of work in my time, but you, Tom, you might be in the top 5. Tom's nostrils flared. Look, I don't owe anyone anything. I run my business how I see fit. Hawk chuckled darkly. Yeah, then you better be ready for the consequences of treating people like garbage. Tom narrowed his eyes. Is that a threat? Grizzly smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. Oh, not at all, just a promise. Before Tom could fire back, the bell above the diner's door jingled. Everyone turned to see a group of local police officers step inside. Sheriff Mark Reynolds led the way, his sharp eyes sweeping over the room as if he could sense the tension hanging in the air. Tom straightened, a smug smirk curling at the edges of his lips. Well, well, Sheriff, perfect timing. Jim and the bikers remained still, their years of training kicking in as they assessed the situation. Sheriff Reynolds approached, his gaze flicking between Jim, the bikers, and Tom. Got a call about a disturbance. His voice was even, but there was an underlying sharpness to it. Tom wasted no time. That's right, Sheriff. These guys are causing trouble, being disrespectful to my staff, making threats. Sarah's eyes went wide. That's not true, she blurted before she could stop herself. Reynolds turned to her. That's so. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. Jim didn't do anything wrong. They didn't do anything wrong. Reynolds studied her for a moment, then shifted his attention back to Jim. That true. Jim met his gaze evenly. Just came in for a meal, Sheriff, that's all. Reynolds glanced at the bikers. And you boys? Grizzly leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Just making sure our brother here was treated fairly. Reynolds exhaled through his nose. He turned back to Tom. Did they break anything, hurt anyone? Tom's confidence flickered. No, but... Then I don't see a problem. Tom's mouth fell open. But Sheriff... Reynolds held up a hand. Enough. I've known Jim Carter a long time, served with his old man. He turned to Jim. You good here? Jim nodded once. Yeah, I'm good. Reynolds gave him a firm nod, then looked at Tom. Might want to rethink how you treat people, Tom. Small town like this, word gets around. Tom's face burned red, but he said nothing. Satisfied, Reynolds turned on his heel. Enjoy your meal, boys. As the sheriff and his deputies exited, the tension in the room shifted. Jim looked at Grizzly, then the others. They all had the same expression. The fight wasn't over yet. And they weren't done making their point. The sheriff's departure left a charged silence in the diner, the tension still thick in the air. Tom Riley stood behind the counter, his face a mixture of frustration and unease. He had expected the law to be on his side, but Sheriff Mark Reynolds had left him hanging, making it clear that he wasn't about to play into Tom's petty power trip. The group of bikers, Grizzly, Viper, Diesel, Ghost, and Hawk, remained seated around the table, their presence an undeniable force in the room. Their expressions were unreadable, but their body language made one thing clear: they weren't finished here. Jim Carter sat in the midst of them, his posture calm but his mind racing. He had endured plenty of disrespect over the years, being overlooked, dismissed, treated as if his service meant nothing. But there was something about this moment that made it different. Sarah, the waitress, hesitated before stepping closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want to say thank you for standing up to him." Viper gave her a reassuring nod. "You don't gotta thank us, sweetheart, just doing what's right." She glanced toward Tom, who was now wiping down the counter with jerky, agitated movements. "You guys should know he's done this before, not just to Jim but to other vets, other folks he doesn't think belong here." Jim's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed lit a fire in his chest. Grizzly leaned back, arms crossed over his broad chest. "That's so." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, a couple of months ago, a Vietnam vet named Earl came in. He was short on cash, and Tom made a big scene about how he wasn't running a charity. Humiliated him right in front of everyone." Hawk scoffed. Man served his country and couldn't even get a warm meal. Sarah's eyes darted to the door, as if afraid Tom might overhear. "He never came back after that night. And there's others, people he's run off just because they didn't fit his idea of who should eat here." Jim exchanged a look with Grizzly, then Viper. The same unspoken decision passed between them. They weren't letting this stand. Jim exhaled slowly, then turned to Sarah. "You got a piece of paper and a pen?" She frowned, confused, but nodded and quickly retrieved them from behind the counter. Jim took the pen and started writing something down. The bikers leaned in, watching with interest. When he finished, he pushed the paper toward Sarah. "Can you do me a favor and put this up in the front window?" She hesitated before looking at what he had written. Her lips parted slightly as she read it, then her eyes flickered to Jim, a slow smile forming. "I'd be honored." Tom, still oblivious to what was happening, slammed a glass down on the counter. "You boys done yet? Or are you planning to set up camp in my diner?" Grizzly stretched his arms lazily. "Well, now that you mention it, I think we'll stick around a bit longer." Viper smirked. "Yeah, might be real interesting to see what kind of folks walk through that door tonight." Tom's expression darkened. He was about to say something else when the bell above the door jingled again. This time it wasn't the sheriff. A small group of older men stepped inside, their faces worn by time, their jackets adorned with patches and insignias that spoke of battles long past. Veterans. Tom's face drained of color. Grizzly grinned. Would you look at that?" The veterans looked around, their gazes settling on Jim and the bikers. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a Marine Corps cap, gave Jim a nod. "Heard there was a problem here. Thought we'd drop by." Jim stood up and extended his hand. "Appreciate that, Captain Reynolds." The captain, the sheriff's older brother and a highly respected veteran in town, took Jim's hand in a firm shake before turning to the counter. His sharp eyes locked onto Tom. "Got a problem with vets, do ya?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of decades of leadership. Tom stammered, caught completely off guard. I don't know what you're talking about." The captain smirked. "That's funny because I heard otherwise." Before Tom could respond, the bell jingled again. More people walked in. Some were veterans. Others were locals, people who had served, people who had family in the military, people who simply believed in treating others with respect. Sarah, now standing by the window, stepped aside to reveal the sign Jim had written. "Veterans eat free here tonight." Tom's eyes bulged. "What the hell is this?" Jim met his gaze evenly. "Something you should have done a long time ago." Tom sputtered, but the reality of the situation was sinking in fast. His diner was filling with people. Not just the bikers, not just Jim, but the entire town was beginning to take notice. Diesel chuckled. "You know, Tom, you could have been the good guy here, could have been the one to offer a little kindness. But nah, you chose to be a real piece of work instead." The captain crossed his arms. "So, what's it gonna be? You gonna serve these folks, or you planning to run your business straight into the ground?" Tom opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around at the faces staring back at him, faces of men and women who had sacrificed more than he ever would. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and out of excuses. With a deep scowl, he grabbed a stack of menus and slammed them onto the counter. "Fine, but this is a one-time thing." Jim smiled, but there was a knowing look in his eyes. "We'll see about that." As the veterans and bikers took their seats, Sarah moved swiftly to take their orders, her steps lighter than before. The atmosphere in the diner had completely shifted. What had once been a place where some weren't welcome was now a place where people stood together. And as Jim looked around, surrounded by old brothers-in-arms and new friends alike, he realized something. This wasn't just about one meal. This was about respect. And tonight they had one. The atmosphere in the diner had changed entirely. Just an hour ago, the place had been filled with tension, thick with the weight of an unjust decision. Now, as plates clattered and voices hummed in conversation, it was a scene of warmth, unity, and quiet defiance. Jim Carter sat among his newfound allies, watching as veterans, bikers, and locals alike shared a meal, laughing and exchanging stories. The sharp sting of humiliation that had burned inside him earlier had faded, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. Across the diner, Captain Reynolds sat with a group of older veterans, their voices carrying bits and pieces of old war tales and shared experiences. The biker gang, Grizzly, Viper, Diesel, Hawk, and Ghost, were fully at ease, their imposing presence now serving as a protective barrier for those who had once felt unwelcome here. Sarah, the waitress, moved from table to table, her steps quicker and lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Each time she passed Jim's table, she shot him a knowing smile. Then there was Tom Riley. The diner's owner stood behind the counter, his jaw set, his movements stiff. Every plate he placed on the pass-through was a silent act of surrender. He had lost control of his own establishment, and he knew it. Yet, he didn't dare voice his anger. Not now, not with the sheriff's brother sitting among those he had tried to turn away. Jim took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness a sharp contrast to the sweetness of victory. He knew men like Tom. He had encountered them time and again, people who only respected authority when it was forced upon them. A part of him wanted to rub it in, to call Tom out in front of everyone, but another part of him, the part that had seen war, loss, and hardship, knew it wasn't necessary. Tonight's event spoke louder than words ever could. Still, he wasn't done just yet. Jim wiped his hands on a napkin, set it down, and pushed his chair back, standing to his full height. The room quieted slightly as he moved. He felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him as he walked toward the counter. Tom barely glanced up as Jim approached, focusing instead on wiping down a perfectly clean section of the counter. But when Jim placed both hands firmly on the surface, Tom froze. Jim let the silence stretch for a beat before he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You ever served Tom?" Tom's grip on the rag tightened. "No." Jim nodded slowly, didn't think so. A flicker of something passed over Tom's face. Anger, shame, maybe both. Jim exhaled, his gaze steady. Men and women who serve this country do it knowing they may never come home. They do it without asking for anything in return. But the least they deserve, the very least, is respect. Tom's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing. Jim tilted his head slightly. I get it. Maybe you don't like bikers, maybe you don't like vets, maybe you just don't like being told what to do. He paused. But what you did tonight, that wasn't about business. That was about power, about making a man feel small just because you could. A muscle in Tom's jaw twitched. Jim leaned in slightly. Well, guess what? You ain't got that power anymore. Tom's face reddened, but still he held his tongue. Jim straightened, his voice steady. That sign in the window, it's staying up. Veterans eat free here, every last one of them. And if I hear otherwise, he gestured toward the crowded diner, you won't just be dealing with me. Tom's eyes flickered around the room. The message was clear. Grizzly let out a low chuckle from across the diner. Sounds like a fair deal to me. Viper smirked. Yeah, don't think the sheriff would mind enforcing it either. Tom swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Then finally he muttered, fine. Jim gave a small nod. Good choice. Without another word, he turned and made his way back to his table. As soon as he sat down, Sarah approached with a fresh cup of coffee. That was something, she said, pouring him a fresh cup. I don't think I've ever seen Tom back down like that. Jim chuckled softly. Maybe he just needed the right kind of encouragement. Sarah smiled before leaning in slightly. You know, the town could use a place where folks feel welcome, not just vets, but anyone who's been made to feel like they don't belong. Jim lifted a brow. You suggesting I start my own diner? She shrugged playfully. Maybe. Jim shook his head, but a small smile played on his lips. I think I'll stick to fighting battles like these. Sarah grinned. Well, if you ever change your mind, I'll be the first to apply. The night carried on, the diner buzzing with conversation and laughter. For the first time in a long time, Jim felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of belonging. And as he looked around at the people who had stood by him, who had refused to let injustice slide, he realized something even more important. Sometimes the smallest battles, the ones fought in diners and town squares, were just as important as the ones fought on the battlefield. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't given, it's defended. And tonight they had done just that. The night stretched on, but no one was in a hurry to leave. The diner, once a cold and unwelcoming place, now radiated warmth, not from the overhead lights but from the people inside. Laughter echoed across the booths, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the rich aroma of burgers and fries. Jim Carter sat back in his chair, his gaze drifting across the room. He watched as the bikers exchanged war stories with the older veterans, their voices deep and full of emotion. There was a mutual respect between them, a bond that stretched beyond words. Even those who had never served could feel the weight of the sacrifices these men had made. At a corner table, Sarah leaned in close to Grizzly, listening intently as he spoke about his time overseas. The hardened biker's voice was rough, but his words carried a sincerity that few ever got to hear. Nearby, Hawk and Diesel chuckled over some inside joke, their booming laughter filling the room. For the first time in years, Jim felt at peace. He took another sip of his coffee, savoring the moment. Then a voice broke through his thoughts. You know, Jim, Grizzly said, his gruff tone laced with amusement, if we didn't show up tonight, were you planning on taking on that whole diner by yourself? Jim smirked. I might be old, but I ain't that dumb, maybe just Tom and his cook. The table erupted into laughter. Even Viper, the quietest among them, cracked a rare grin. Sarah wiped a tear from her eye, shaking her head. Well, I'm glad you all walked in when you did. I don't think I could have handled watching Tom throw Jim out like that. Jim's smirk faded slightly. He set his cup down, tapping his fingers against the ceramic. Wouldn't be the first time I've been tossed aside. The table quieted. The weight of Jim's words settled over them like a heavy fog. Grizzly leaned forward, his massive arms resting on the table. Yeah, we know that feeling all too well. Jim met his gaze, nodding slowly. People think the battle ends when you come home, Jim continued, his voice softer now. But it doesn't. The war follows you. Some nights it whispers, other nights it screams, and the worst part, he exhaled. Most folks don't even see you anymore, like you're just part of the past. A few of the bikers murmured in agreement. Ghost, who had been silent for most of the night, finally spoke. That's why we stick together, because no one else gets it. Jim studied the men around him. Rough, battle-worn, carrying scars, both seen and unseen. And yet they had stood by him tonight without hesitation. Well, Jim said, leaning back with a small smile. Looks like I found myself a new unit. Grizzly let out a bark of laughter. Damn right you did. The others chuckled, nodding in agreement. Just then the diner door swung open. A gust of cold night air swept through, making Sarah shiver as she turned to see who had entered. It was Sheriff Hank Reynolds. The room fell silent. The sheriff, a man built like a brick wall with a mustache to match, stepped inside. His eyes flicked across the crowd before finally landing on Jim. Jim straightened slightly, his hands resting on the table. The sheriff walked forward, the heavy thud of his boots echoing in the stillness. He stopped just short of Jim's table, glancing around at the men seated with him. Then, finally, his gaze settled back on Jim. Got a call from Tom, Reynolds said, voice gruff. Jim raised a brow. That's so. The sheriff exhaled sharply. Said a bunch of bikers took over his diner, wanted me to restore order. Hawk scoffed. That's one way to spin it. Reynolds scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing slightly. He also said something about a "Veterans Eat Free" sign being put up without his approval. Jim didn't flinch. That's right. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward Tom, who was lingering behind the counter, pale and silent. Reynolds sighed. Well, I had a look at the town's business regulations on my way over here. He turned back to Jim. And I didn't see anything about a restaurant owner being forced to feed veterans. Jim held his stare. No one's forcing him, but it's the right thing to do. The sheriff crossed his arms, and if he takes the sign down. A slow smile spread across Jim's face. Then we'll be back, every night, and I'm guessing the whole town's gonna hear about it too. Reynolds glanced around the room again, seeing the way people looked at Jim, not just as a man but as a symbol of something bigger. He let out a breath, shaking his head. Well, he finally said, far as I'm concerned, there's no law against having a sign in your window. Jim smirked. Appreciate that, Sheriff. Reynolds looked back at Tom. If you got a problem with it, I suggest you take it up with your customers. Tom's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. With that, the sheriff gave Jim a nod, turned on his heel and walked back toward the door. Before stepping outside, he paused and looked over his shoulder. By the way, Reynolds added, I got a few vets on my force. Might be stopping by for a meal sometime. Jim chuckled. I'll make sure they get a warm welcome. The sheriff grunted, then disappeared into the night. The tension in the room evaporated as the door swung shut. Grizzly let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Sarah grinned. I think you just made history, Jim. Jim shook his head, picking up his coffee again. I didn't do a thing. I just reminded folks what respect looks like. The others murmured in agreement. As the hours passed, people slowly began trickling out, heading home with full stomachs and even fuller hearts. The bikers were the last to leave, each of them giving Jim a firm handshake or a pat on the shoulder before stepping into the night. Sarah wiped down the last table, exhaustion evident in her features, but there was a lightness in her step. You need anything before I close up? Jim shook his head. "No, ma'am, I think I got everything I need." As he stepped outside, the night air was crisp and cool. He looked up at the sky, the stars shining down like silent sentinels. For the first time in years, Jim didn't feel invisible, didn't feel forgotten. He had stood his ground, and for once the world had taken notice. And maybe, just maybe, this town had changed for the better.